Shalom uvracha to everyone. I hope everyone is well on this um, Thursday morning. Erev Parshat Shemot. We're about to begin a new book of the Torah. We're going from the world of the family to the world of the nation to talk about Am Yisrael. For the first time in the history of the Torah, the Jewish people are called an Am. At the very beginning of the Parsha, the Jewish people at the beginning, the Eila Shemot Bnei Yisrael, which refers to the clan that came to Egypt. But by the end of that section, Uvnei Yisrael, Paru vayishritzu vayirbu vayatzmu be'od ma'od. At that point, the word Bnei Yisrael means the people, the nation. And so this is a book about the nation, about the forging and the formation of the nation of Am Yisrael, the crucible of suffering that they experienced in Egypt, and of course the heights of being redeemed, the redemption from Egypt, Sefer HaGeula, as the rabbis call it, and obviously reaching the pinnacle at Sinai and entering into a relationship, into a covenantal relationship with God. And so this is a very powerful book, and it's a book where at the beginning we repeat the words of Sefer Bereshit, back to Parshat Vayigash, Ve'ela Shemot B'nei Yisrael, and then we continue B'nei Yisrael. And for the first time, the Jewish people are called an Am. And I want to focus for a second on that little section because it has a lot of relevance to the horrific events, the terrible events that occurred in our country yesterday, prior to the positive event of affirming the democratic election of President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Harris yesterday. Despite the objections, which are legitimate, people are allowed to object and use the democratic process, but they were affirmed, and we look forward to them being inaugurated in Yirtzeh Hashem on January 20th. The Torah tells us about Am Yisrael. Am Yisrael has been ensconced in the land of Egypt for many years, decades, maybe hundreds of years. The Torah doesn't specify explicitly how long. We know that by the end, the Torah says explicitly that the Jewish people were in Egypt for 400 years. Chazal say that there was only 200 years of shibud, 210 years of shibud, but the text explicitly in Parshat Bo says that they were there for 400 years. That's a long time, longer than the history of this country, of the United States of America. The Jewish people became ensconced in the land of Egypt. They lived in a specific region in Eretz Goshen, but slowly they probably integrated into parts of Egyptian society. And they were fully members of the Egyptian society. Chazal, in fact, take them to task. Vatimalei haaretz otam, in some midrashim, the rabbis speak of them as being too assimilated, too integrated, too involved in the social, economic, and political life, and maybe even religious life of Egypt. But they were full-fledged citizens, and they contributed a tremendous amount to Egyptian society. Joseph had saved the economy. Joseph had done great things. The Jewish people contributed and were fully part of them. And yet, maybe there were grievances against the Jewish people. Grievances that maybe they were outsiders, they were foreigners. Grievances that they had been too successful. Grievances that they had changed the country that the Egyptians were used to. Grievances that Joseph had manipulated the economy and they had gotten to, whatever it was, there were grievances. And Paro, by his words, took advantage of those grievances. And he turned them into an enemy. Vayomer el amo, hine am b'nei Yisrael. He's not simply talking to his advisors. If you look at the Pshat, he speaks to his people. His words, his rhetoric impacts on the people. Hine am b'nei Yisrael rav atzum mimenu. They've become very numerous. They're all over the place. They're elites. They don't care about you. They have different agendas. They're a fifth column. They're not patriotic. We have to be smart. If there's, God forbid, a war, He uses the power of fear and the power of rhetoric and the power of grievances to turn parts of the Egyptian people against their fellow citizens, loyal citizens, against their own people, in a sense, divides, and ultimately, that's the beginning of the enslavement. Vayasimu alav sarei misim l'manan oto b'sivlotam. And that begins the process of enslavement, which ultimately yields to violence and the attempt to murder every Jewish boy baby. Words have consequences. Rhetoric, playing on people's grievances and directing them without positive direction, but in effect, laying the groundwork for worse and, God forbid, dangerous, violent outcomes, is one of the messages that emerges from this episode here at the beginning of Parshat Shemot. As I said, this was a difficult week for the United States. And we have to be honest and we have to recognize that rhetoric has consequences across the board. But especially this week, we have to say it loud and clear. Some of us have been saying it privately, but without wanting to speak politically. The rhetoric of President Trump and some of his supporters and some of his advisors and some of his political allies over the last 4 years has been inappropriate, has crossed the line of demonizing people, playing on people's fears and not their hopes, of othering so many other Americans and immigrants, and of really setting the stage for the events that happened yesterday, where people who were already fired up with grievances and lies and were not willing to accept the democratic outcome of the elections and the courts, which is the way that we exist as a democratic society. When you have grievances and you bring it to the courts and you try the best possible. And they were incited by the rhetoric of telling people that they should go to Capitol Hill and encouraging them, and over the years, disparaging others and disparaging political officials and those who you disagree with, which of course also exists on the left, but specifically this week, unfortunately, the President of the United States and his family and others who have the power, have the bully pulpit, and have the responsibility of leadership, they were the ones who unfortunately lit the match that was just ready to explode. And we saw the violence, the rampage, the crossing of boundaries, the disregard for constitutional and democratic norms, the sullying of our capital. These are things that people must take responsibility for. These are things that cross the line. These are examples of rhetoric that has consequences. Rhetoric has consequences. Unfortunately, our president over the last 4 years, from the very beginning of his campaign, even if one agreed with certain policies that he took, and again, policy debates are totally legitimate and normal, and you can have a very conservative, very far-right perspective, you can have a very far-left, very progressive perspective, that doesn't matter. But the rhetoric that you use in relationship to your opponents, in the relationship to fellow Americans, in the relationship to people, has consequences. And that's one of the messages of this week's portion. It's a sad message that we saw this week, where our elected leaders were threatened, had to run, had to hide, had to shelter in place, not from external threats, but from our own internal. And people who already were on the edge were pushed over by the rhetoric of the person who has the highest office and is duty bound to ensure justice and peace and to ensure the democratic norms and the functioning of government. And so we say this with great sadness. At the same time, we are happy. We are, we recognize that there's continuity of government, that Congress affirmed the will of the electorate, that Emir Hashem on January 20th, we will have a new administration, and hopefully they can also be careful. They also will learn some of the lessons, because unfortunately sometimes in some places, again, it's not equivalent, I'm not going into the equivalency, there are times in certain progressive circles that language is used which is inappropriate and needs to be called out. And hopefully President Biden and Vice President Harris will be able to bring our country closer, to unify us more, to bring us to where the sense of an Am, which occurs in this week's Parsha, will be also our sense as an American nation, one nation under God, indivisible. That's what we want to strive for. And we want to, again, hope that the blessing of God shines upon us. God shed his grace on thee, as the song goes. And we hope that that will emerge more whole, and people's revulsion at what happened this week will translate also internally into a better rhetoric and a better action in relationship to our fellow Americans. Shabbat Shalom.